Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Good morning, Dr. Rapici. How are you today?
No, Dr. Falk, I am
good.
Full of beans.
Good.
I'm feeling
full of
good.
beans. We're going to continue that. I'd like to think it's a Southern vernacular, but I don't know if it is actually.
I feel like it should be British.
Our listeners, such as they are.
If you too are full of beans, let us know where the beans came from.
Yeah.
Anyways,
where that phrase came from.
Yes, to your question, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well as well. And we're here today to talk about Jean Baudrillard's 1981, 1982, written somewhere at the end of the late 70s, published in the early 80s. His essay, The Precession of Simulacra, which was part of his book on Simulacra and Simulations, and where he introduces a concept that's really important for media studies, and we're going to talk about it today. And I think what's that concept? The concept is the notion of the hyperreal, and we're going to explain more about what that means in a moment. But we should also give a brief preview that not only Baudrillard is going to be a little bit of our, he's a platform, he's a node, a launch point for two things. Number one, first and foremost, after our discussion of this particular essay, the first chapter of the Simulacra and Simulation book, we eventually are going to talk about how this connects with our modern idea of the hyperreal, as evidenced in AI. So that's one of the things we're going. But I think we should also say this, Michael, and we didn't talk about this off camera, so this is totally going to floor you, my friend. No, it's
right.
Not. No, it's not. But I was thinking of this conversation, the impetus for, I think it's worth saying, the impetus for talking about Baudrillard is that we have been talking about for at least 2 episodes. We have been talking about simulated environments in certain respects or not. In a way, we've been talking about 3 examples of simulated environments. And if you go back to De Boer, there are 4 examples of simulated environments. But just to think about the last 2 episodes, we talked about Susan Sontag and her argument that we tend to equate the real, whatever it is, with photography, with a photographic image. So that is one sort of hyper reality, one kind of simulated reality that we treat in exchange, interchangeably with reality. And of course, behind Sontag's version of this photographic simulacra, there was Plato, right? There was the, Platonic at the very beginning of philosophy. There was Plato's concern about the nature of what we see and its relation to knowledge, as evidence in Plato's cave. And then more recently, and I think in our last episode that posted, we talked about Andre Bazin and his theory of photography. Now, of course, as we also said, Bazin is talking about photographs because he's interested in the larger question of aesthetic realism. And he's particularly interested in aesthetic realism insofar as it relates to cinema. So he has a very different trajectory from Sontag, even though she mentions film in her study of photography. But he makes some remarks that were, kind of prepare us and got us thinking about the hyperreal, because he also and in fact, this is something, I don't recall this, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't recall this clearly stated in Plato's Cave in the Sontag chapter we discussed. But it is a really brilliant insight that Bazin captures in his Capsule History of Photography. This observation that one of the reasons, he makes the basic claim that Sontag does, that there's a way photography is an epochal event in the history of the arts, plastic arts, as he says, because of its unique ability to stand in for reality, its unique relation to the real. And then he makes this point that I don't think Sontag makes quite as clearly. One of the reasons, he says, that we trust the photographic image so much intuitively, and he even says, like Sontag, he questions our credibility on this part, but nonetheless, he says the fact that photographic images are the product of a mechanical process. That's one of the reasons why we tend to trust them so totally, why they seem to offer a better relation to the real than any kind of painting. Because painting, no matter what, no matter how advanced, no matter how complex, regardless of the cultural context, it will always be the product of the human hand. And therefore, in our own minds, perhaps somewhat suspect to what machines can do. Yeah. So all this, I didn't mean to do the long preamble, but I think it's kind of helpful. I hope it's kind of helpful, simply because when we talk about Baudrillard today, it's in this context, what drew us to the text. And what we're talking about today, we're not only thinking about AI, but we have some of these larger aesthetic philosophical questions in our head, all floating around here in the soup.
I actually want to sort of look at that just again real quickly before we start talking about Baudrillard, because I think that Plato, then Sontag, then Bazin really give us, if you look at the three of them together, not in terms of necessarily who's making what argument, but the those three arguments laid next to each other give us a good grounding for why Baudrillard is important, right? So if you think about the allegory of the cave with Plato, one of the things there's a lot going on there, obviously, but one of the basic tenets of that is, hey, we can misunderstand what we see as being something else. We can misunderstand one representation that may be real as a fiction, or a fiction for reality, right? And so that's there's your Plato in 6 seconds.
And one is able to escape it with that realization. For Plato, there's a
but escape, right? But again, escaping it is going to put you outside. It's going to put you on the outside,
absolutely,
right? Sontag's argument was that we look at photographs and we don't see the artifice in the photography.
Right.
We see the image and we immediately equate that image or associate that image with a real moment, right, whatever real means.
Let me add something to that because it's important. One of the reasons why that's bad, what you said, according to Sontag, is that our apprehension of the real in the photograph, and this is one of her points in Plato's Cave, one of the reasons why that's wrong is that it's a quick equation of the real that is detached from narrative, context, history.
Right.
So that we're making a mistake because we too quickly rush to the idea that the image is presented as a truth that is somehow outside of history, conversation, things like that.
Right. And the fact that let's let
context.
The fact that we're off script not be lost here at all, right? Because another interesting thing implicit in that argument is this notion of speed and how quickly we move to interpret. But so you have Sontag's argument, and she's saying, to be clear, to reiterate what you were saying there, this is wrong, right? Like the image that we see is not representative of an actual event. It is a creative moment. It's art, which gets us to Bazin, where he's basically saying photography frees art to be art, painting to be art. His argument is that the mechanical aspects of photography that differentiate it from painting, i.e. no artist and brush, this is a chemical reaction that takes place, lead us to look at photography as being authentic or real. My point in laying these out is that each of these perspectives, Plato, Sontag, Bazin, give us a very clear platform on which to stand if we're going to say, hey, the notion of reality is a slippery one, right? What is real is very, very tricky to try and pin down. And so I think by means or as a means of getting into our discussion today, I am going to attempt, with your permission, a quick gloss of Baudrillard so that we can talk about him with a few things just set on the table for us. So the argument in a nutshell is that we are not able to distinguish between reality and the sort of representations of reality that we get. And he starts out with the story of the map that is so precisely drawn and to scale that it overlays the original, and in time the two become indistinguishable. And then he goes on to say that we've reached a point essentially where the map precedes the real, right? That we have reached a point where our simulations, our maps, actually come before the reality. And I'm assuming that is the precession of the simulacra. So the argument here is that in the maps creating their own reality because they precede our understanding of reality. And I think the easiest way of looking at this is we could go back to Williams, for example, with his discussion about the inventions being, these things that are suddenly new and everything. Everything is invented for a specific reason, and then we come to see them as being solutions to other problems. Baudrillard is basically saying that that's what's happening, right? We're getting our maps, and then we're finding uses for them. The real exists after the map has already been laid down. So his term for this.
So just to add a sentence to that. So one of the logical conclusions that, or one of the arguments that he makes that logically follows from what you said, is the question of priority. Because of this quick relay, it becomes impossible to distinguish the prior map to the which is prior, the map or the territory, becomes impossible to distinguish.
Exactly. And so he calls this, the hyperreal. Okay, so that's his term. We're going to probably be revisiting it often. The problem is, right, that the hyperreal is indistinguishable from the real. The simulation is so accurate that it becomes indistinguishable from the real. And so at the core of this, or one of the things at the core of this, is that the inability to distinguish the real and the simulation ultimately undermines the real, right? That we have to question whatever it is that we think of as real, because we can never know whether it's a simulation or whether it is whatever thing would be authentic. And the problem comes into being here because all things can be simulated. So we're left with this sort of existential crisis, if you will, of what's real and what's not. And anything that could be real has to be questioned. And so Can I
interrupt you right there? Just
by all means.
only to, I'm not going to add anything to what you said, but I think this might be a good place to very quickly read a passage from Baudrillard that directly is pertinent to what you said. So this is whatever PDF one steals from Google. This is about 3 paragraphs into it, the passage I'm going to read very briefly. This is, I think, Michael, what you were just speaking about directly. Or this passage is directly pertinent to what you were just speaking about. The real is produced from miniaturized cells, matrices, and memory banks, models of control. And it can be reproduced an indefinite number of times from these. So this is sort of talking about the fact that the map, one of the advantages of making the map is that you can make many copies of the map, right? And then going on from there, it's the points very directly related to what you just discoursed on. It no longer needs to be rational because it no longer measures itself against either an ideal or a negative case, a negative instance. It is no longer anything but I love this phrase because of that verb. It is no longer anything but operational. I don't know if that's a verb, actually. That's an adverb, right? What is operational? I don't know. I'm an English professor. I should know. Don't know. But I love that word, operational. In fact, it is no longer really the real because no imaginary envelopes it anymore. In other words, it's to have the real, you have to have an imaginary as an envelope. We no longer have that strict demarcation between the real and the imaginary that allows for both to exist. Instead, we have, quote, final sentence, it is now the hyperreal, produced from a synthesis of combinatory models in a hyperspace without atmosphere. In other words, it's only referring to itself. The hyperreal is its own thing, and it no longer exists in reference to the real or the imaginary.
Right, because it essentially dissolves the real.
because it dissolves it.
So I think the thing is that if I'm reading your reading of this correct, what he's basically saying here is that the hyperreal essentially dissolves the real because of its what's the word I want to use here? Because of its precision, because of its...
And the imaginary. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And also the imaginary. So that one can't simply say, well, there is to have those two concepts. I guess this is a Hegel thing. To have those two concepts, you have to, I don't know, you need the negation of the concept to have the concept work in both cases. And what the hyperreal does is it gets rid of the negation. There's no third term. It just envelopes them without producing a synthesis. Mm-hmm. They no longer contain a negation.
Right. And I think that the argument in that, right, is that we need difference. We need one to have the other, right? This is, you got to have evil to have good. You got to have up to have down, whatever. The problem with the hyperreal is that because the division that gives meaning to both is gone, we don't really have any sense of meaning one way or another. And there's a couple different examples. So the two that we're going to talk about, he talks about Disney in ways that, you know, Disney and nostalgia in a sense, in terms of, you know, what's going on. He uses Disney as an example of how this works. And the other one that I found really interesting, he talks about Watergate. And it's not a question of, you know, what is Watergate? Who did the thing about Watergate that I think is really interesting is he talks about the scandal of Watergate as and the outrage that surrounds it as a mechanism for creating, and same with Disney, really, these mechanisms for creating a false divide, right? Where the idea of the real and the simulated, you know, the simulation, where we think we can see this difference. Baudrillard does a really interesting job of identifying these moments where what we think of as difference really just sort of fold back in onto each other. So should we start with Disney?
Let's do that. I should say, I just Googled it, used AI for a moment because as an English professor, I would get my license revoked. It is a question about operational, whether it's a noun, verb, or an adjective. But Google says it's an adjective. Just telling you, just letting everyone know.
I feel like
I know you're ready to go now.
Yeah, we're ready to person go. Myself, I feel like I can sleep now. So let's talk about Disney. The argument that he's making about Disney, and we'll start at a fairly high level here and dig down as we feel necessary, Barry. Disney is a fiction, right? We go into Disney and we see this ideal sort of fantasy land, and in understanding, and you know, I guess there's a series of liminal spaces between, right? Like we have the world outside of Disney, we have the parking lot, which sort of buffers the fiction that is Disney with the real world outside of Disney. But his point is that when we go into Disneyland, we recognize that we are in a space, right, defined by a parking lot that separates us from the outside of Disney. That
we're inside Disney when we enter Disneyland. That's one of it.
And in being in Disney,
right.
And I think anybody who's been to a theme park understands, right? There's a real difference between being in the park and being out of the park. And his point is that when you're in the park, you recognize that you are in a fiction, and that being in this fiction creates the impression that life outside of the fiction, i.e. Los Angeles,
is the opposite, is the negation. Is the negation, right? This is the Hegelian negation.
Right.
The negation, reality, it's in Los Angeles, right? Mm-hmm. So Los Angeles is by definition, by this kind of definition through negation, ends up representing the real, because Disneyland is obviously the realm of illusion and fantasy and play.
Right. I have the section here. I kind of want to,
please,
to read this. And so, Disneyland exists in order to hide that it is the real country, all of real America, that is Disneyland. A bit like prisons are there to hide that it is in the social in its entirety, in its banal omnipresence that is carceral. Disneyland is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real, whereas all of Los Angeles and the America that surrounds it are no longer real, but belong to the hyperreal order and to the order of simulation. It is no longer a question of a false representation of reality, but of concealing the fact that the real is no longer real, and thus of saving the reality principle. The imaginary of Disneyland is neither true nor false. It is a deterrence machine set up in order to rejuvenate the fiction of the real in the opposite camp. That is a mouthful, and I'm going to be honest with you. One of the things that I struggled with as I went through this again was the urge to just call this, can I swear?
Can we now? Because we're not on YouTube.
I just want to call it bullshit. Yeah. I want to sit here and say, how is it possible that you're going to say the city of Los Angeles is false? So let's start here. How do we want to unpack this?
I want to run from this because I have I want to run from this because I as you were reading it, Michael, I have the same quibble. So I'm going to try and do an interpretation here. One of the businesses of interpretation is to think about the beginnings of interpretation in Neoplatonic commentary or biblical commentary. One of the reasons you have an interpretation of a text to begin with is because you have a problem with that text, especially the literal meaning of the text. It's a passage that's always troubled me. And I'm going to speak for it positively, and then I'm going to speak for it negatively. And you'll help me make more sense out of it and my interpretation. Okay, let me give you the positive spin on this. As a thought experiment, the examples of Disneyland and Watergate, I know you want to talk about the Watergate example, think they're really, really, really powerful. And I understand totally why this is a generative essay. In that, what's really powerful about this? As a thought experiment, it's great because it captures that way of formulating, perfectly captures a kind of brilliant insight, which is that the difference between that, well, I'm going to quote William Blake. William Blake says in the poem, is it London? Prisons are made out of bricks of religion. Or no, brothels are built out of bricks of religion. Prisons are built out of order. That poetic insight, that order, purity, cleanliness, morality requires its other. And in fact, the relation between, say, morality and immorality it's symbiotic. It's not even an opposition. It's symbiotic. One needs the moral prohibition against prostitution to create the institution prostitution. I think that, that's what I take Baudrillard to be doing here when he makes the distinction between Disneyland and Los Angeles. And so, in other words, he's saying this is not a strict opposition. In our real life, in our waking moments, we treat this as a strict opposition. But the reality is that this is a symbiotic. The reality, quote unquote, is that this is a symbiotic reality. There's a symbiosis going on here. There's a synergy between the prohibition and the moral prohibition and the quote unquote transgression. So, and in making this formulation, he captures, and he goes on to say, as you know, think about it. LA. LA is your real? Think about LA. It's the land of Hollywood. There are theme parks besides Disneyland outside of Disneyland, but also in LA. Where is this much vaunted real that you're talking about when you say there's a fantasy land over here and then there's reality out there? So this is the positive version. This is the positive insight, and it's a great insight. It's a poetic insight. It's a brilliant metaphor. If I like William Blake, I gotta like Jean Baudrillard. So as a thought experiment, it's unparalleled, I think, in its precision, and more than that, its beauty. Here's what I don't like about it. What I don't like about it is that if one lingers in that moment, in that insight, I think, my reservation, I won't speak for you, but because I'm going to allow you to speak for you and your reservation, but my reservation is that once you get out of the realm of metaphor, I worry that if you insist on it's all Disneyland, that you are missing the fact that we are complicit in creating the bad reality that, he makes the opposition. He makes our confused perception of hyperreality seem natural. When I think the point is we are complicit in creating this boundary that doesn't exist between Disneyland and reality. And insofar as Baudrillard's wonderful eloquence makes us forget that we are complicit in creating the opposition in creating reality and the imaginary, in making that out of the hyperreal, insofar as we do that, is that he encourages us to do that. I think it's not good.
So as I think about this, I think that the problem and the thing that I responded to with this, and the thing maybe that you respond to, I think a lot of people that read this are going to look at this and call bullshit. It's important to note, that Baudrillard's argument, right, is not a materialist argument. He's not arguing that the city's not real. Okay.
Right.
I think in a way what he's arguing, and I'm going to probably do a couple things here that you're not going to like, Barry. So
that's okay.
I'll apologize ahead of hand. But
I think how is that possible? How's that possible?
He's saying that our structures, maybe it's a structuralist argument, right? That the things that we understand to function in one way don't. And so, you look at, so the thing that popped in my mind as I'm looking at this, obviously, I first see this as a materialist argument. I'm saying, well, how are you going to tell me that lawyers aren't lawyers, teachers aren't teachers? Well, the argument I think that he's making is that, well, your lawyers are lawyers, but the law is this institution that can be bent and shifted depending on how you want to see it. That teachers are teaching and simultaneously indoctrinating and simultaneously encouraging this. Like there's a million different ways to see it. And so the thing that got to me and about this, as I was trying to make sense of it, is and here's where my apology comes in. I thought of Bruno Latour. And I thought of, what he calls with actor network theory and what he calls the black box, right? The idea that a network functions in a way that we take for granted. And it's only when we, lift the hood of the car, for example, that we see all of the different components of the car that work. And and so it ceases to become a car. It's now a series of networks that combine to create a car in this moment. And I think that when you look at something like this, you realize that all of these different networks are continually, infinitely divisible, right? And so the notion of a stable, consistent reality that is a city that does this or an institution that does that is going to be divisible and continually reconfigured. And it's not so much that any one moment is false. It's that these are replicated in a million different ways, right? There are facsimiles of this exact same thing everywhere, but they're also capable of being different things. And so to try and pin it down and say, well, Los Angeles is this, it is, but it isn't. And there's no way of knowing for certain. And that's his argument, right? It's not so much that it's a fiction.
Okay.
It's that it is a simulation of something that is continually being reinvented.
That's great.
And so I mentioned this, I think I wanted to get Latour into the conversation a little bit because I like to do that, but also because I kind of want to jump forward to Watergate because he does something different. He says, and I've got my...
Before you do that, can we put a period? I want to put a period in what you were saying. First off, I want to say thank you for bringing up network theory. That's a better example than my example, I think. I really appreciate you do it. I think that's much more clarifying when I said. So I think you're setting us up well. Also, just before we go on, since I'm making all these very unpardonable English major mistakes, let me try to clarify them in the.
This is the grammar episode.
This is the grammar episode because I was quoting William Blake and misattributing it and butchering it and totally got it wrong. It's not from one of his poems. What I was quoting, but it's helpful. It's helpful to know that it's helpful to know the truth. We'll say,
if there is
and to be somewhat, if there is one, and if there's, well, accuracy is important. Let's not talk about truth. So what I was quoting was the Proverbs of Hell from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell by William Blake. And here were the passages that I had in mind. There is a twinned proverb of hell. And it goes like this. Prisons are built, and I'm going to relate this to try to do this quickly. I'm going to try to relate this to Latour and sort of talk about the difference between our two takes on Disneyland. So Blake writes, prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion. So that's the Blake quote. And why I was quoting that or trying to remember that passage is because I thought that Baudrillard's point, or I think one of the things he's getting at, is he wants us to do away with the idea that prisons are one thing, law is another. Brothels are one thing. Morality and moral codes are another. He wants to talk about their synergy. Now, that said, I prefer what you said to my example, because I think what you were getting at in your answer, and let's see, I don't think this is that much of a digression, Michael, because I think it's going to clarify some when we get to Watergate. Mm-hmm. Because what I like about what you just said about Disneyland and using Latour is that you are getting out of the metaphor and you are saying, let's not think about this in linguistic terms. Let's think of this as a kind of a network. And if we think of the simulation, we think of all these things, the real, the imaginary, simulacra, we think of all this as moments within the network, as something. What was the word you used?
Well,
did you talk about it like at different moments you're accessing something very different? I the think, network metaphor is really helpful.
Yeah, and I think what just I think of a network as sort of as a means of interpretation, right? Like it's through our understanding of a network that we can say, oh, this means this.
I like it.
So shall we jump to Watergate? Because really,
yeah. We should, but I hope that was clarifying because I think I got us in muddy waters, and you helped us get out of there. And now I think we're
let's just muddy this right up then.
Let's muddy it again.
Fortunately, the section on Watergate, Baudrillard says Watergate, the same scenario as Disneyland. So he's saying that Watergate is exactly the same. This is a little bit of reading. I'm going to try and do this clearly. But he says Watergate, the same scenario as Disneyland, effect of the imaginary concealing that reality no more exists outside than inside the limits of the artificial perimeter. He says, here the scandal effect hiding that there is no difference between the facts and their denunciation, identical methods on the part of the CIA and of the Washington Post journalists. I'm going to skip down a little bit. He says, capital, immoral and without scruples, can only function behind a moral superstructure. So again, we've got the two different sides that give each other meaning. Right. So capital, immoral, and without scruples can only function behind a moral superstructure. And whoever revives this public morality through indignation, denunciation, etc., works spontaneously for the order of capital. This is what the journalists of the Washington Post did. But this would be nothing but the formula of ideology. And when Bordeaux states it, he takes the relation of force for the truth of capitalist domination, and he himself denounces this relation of force as scandal. He is thus in the same deterministic and moralistic position of the Washington Post journalists are. He does the same work of purging and reviving moral order, an order of truth in which the veritable symbolic violence of the social order is engendered, well beyond all the relations of force, which are only its shifting and indifferent configuration in the moral and political consciences of men. He goes on to argue essentially that, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, though it's fantastic. He goes on to argue essentially that it is the moral outrage that we feel that functions as that thing that is different, which lets us look at our world as different from this moral outrage and therefore as real. So in other words, moral outrage and Disneyland are the same thing, right? That our regular, non-abused sense of right and wrong is Los Angeles. This is a wonderful sort of what's the juxtaposition here of Disneyland and morality, right? Like, so do we see a difference in the way these two play out?
I have two comments. Is this a good time to make them, or did you want to?
Yeah, no, by all means.
Okay. Two comments where I'm going to continue maybe in my same vein.
Good. Well, you should. It's the same argument.
Well, in my same vein of saying something negative about Jean Baudrillard and then saying something positive. And the positive thing, I'm going to end with that because I think from what we were talking about earlier, the positive thing is where we need to go to bring this boat into dock. Because if we go on this positive argument, we're going to, I think, end up exploring something that's going to relate to AI. But I, since you mentioned the first part of that quote, I can't go with him on that first part of the quote that you read. And I'll tell you why. Because that's precisely what I don't like about Baudrillard. Because what he's saying is that it doesn't matter whether or not you're doing a conservative argument or, as Bourdieu is doing, a negative argument, a Marxist argument. Critique is impossible because you're not allowed to have a critical position, because the functionality of hyperreality is that any kind of criticism of the system, any kind of moral critique is sort of out of, necessarily invalidated by the hyperreal. It may be, but I would actually think that, I don't want to give up that idea of making criticism. So that's the negative part. Huh?
I want to ask you a question about that. And I guess we don't.
He's saying that if I understand him, he's saying that the Watergate reporters and the Marxist critics are alike in that that Marxism is still a kind of morality. It wants to talk about the problems of domination and say that domination is bad, and that both the liberal critique and the Marxist critique are bad because they're both critiques, and there's no possibility of critique of the hyperreal. I'm gonna shoot myself if I give up critique. It's an existential matter for me.
You don't have to.
There is a positive side to this when you're talking about where you went to from that, and I know where you want to go to, is you want to talk about the productivity of moral outrage. That to me is a separate thing. I'm just trying to, and maybe I can't really do this, and maybe I just have to forswear Baudrillard, but I'm just saying I cannot give up. I cannot be as glib and blasé as I think Baudrillard is being, in saying that, well, you know what, the Marxist criticism is the same thing as the liberal criticism. There's no difference because it's the hyperreal. I can't abide that.
But see, I don't know that it works like that, because, so for example, you just said, well, the productivity of moral outrage, right?
Yes, indeed.
What is the productivity of moral outrage other than a fiction?
It is, and that's an interesting thing to talk about. But I want to talk about it as a fiction, my friend.
Well, you have,
and he is saying I can't. And that's where I don't want him to say that.
I don't think so.
That's where I don't go along.
Barry, I'm going to politely disagree with you.
Well,
I think the point of this is that we perceive something as moral indignation. He's saying it's all a smokescreen, right? That the moral indignation is no more real than the parking lot of Disneyland. It's simply something that we perceive to be a barrier between one fiction and another fiction, right? That there's you don't have to give up theory, Barry. The truth of the matter is you never had theory in the first place, bud. What we're doing now, right?
Yeah.
Is pretending. And we're pretending because we don't know any better.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
you
I
know,
have
it's like
existential I mean, all I'm saying, Michael, is I got you. I got him. But it's I have I'm just registering my existential qualms because I wouldn't be doing this if I
but
really
so
believe that.
here,
I
ready?
wouldn't be doing it.
This
I
is going to
wouldn't be
be
doing
awkward, but this is why you don't leave Plato's cave.
it.
Because when you leave the cave, you have to have
Yes.
existential qualms about it. And then you're going to get over them and you're going to come back down and we're going to call you a raving lunatic.
All right. All right. I think okay, we're not going to solve the existential problem. Let's
Well, you
go to the
can't.
moral quandary. Let's go to the moral productivity thing. You were about to go there. Let's go there. That's the positive thing because what he's saying, if I understand you, so that we just talked about and we went round and round on the negative thing, and Michael's never going to cure me for this. I'm incurable. But the thing that I think is really interesting and that I want to think about along with you is where you are getting at with this. You are noticing the productivity, as you call it, and as he calls it, of a fiction. And the fiction is moral outrage that's occasioned by the production, by the particular moment in the network of production that creates the simulacra, that creates the hyperreal. And that his argument, and I think your argument, and I think I agree with this argument, is that there inevitably is this moral outrage that can accompany the latest incarnation or avatar of the simulacra, of the hyperreal. But that this moral discourse, this outrage, is really a fiction. It's a discourse that keeps us, that indeed feeds the hyperreal. And we are seeing that in AI. But you want to say a little bit more about how it relates to Watergate, or do you?
No,
or
I just think
Vietnam,
that, so the purpose, right, of the outrage.
Did I summarize, where you're going with that? Oh, well, or did I do that poorly?
No, I think you did it fantastically. I just think that one of my character flaws is that I need to restate it again so that I can have my words in my head.
Well,
as well.
I would find that helpful if you did. So please.
So I think that the purpose of moral outrage is and again, these are all fictions, right? The purpose of moral outrage is to feed the sense of, and I don't know if this is the right word to use, but if I'm on the spot, it's to feed nostalgia. It's to feed a desire to return to a normal.
He uses that word. I think you're very right to use that. Baudrillard uses the word nostalgia. That's part of this the moral discourse seems to be very closely allied to the production of nostalgia affect. So
here's what's interesting about this idea of a return to normal. And I think that as we inch closer to this discussion of AI, it's probably helpful to sort of start to apply this stuff to things that are more, readily apprehendable, right? If you look at the political situation that we have, you can have any given moment of outrage, right? As polarized as politics are, in any moment of outrage, the two camps are going to both seize upon that moment, agree that there is an outrage, and then run with that outrage in opposite directions
and produce effects out of that affect.
And one of Baudrillard's arguments is that in war, the two warring sides are actually complicit in eventually reaching a predetermined outcome, and that these two sides need each other. Right. And so this is, and so, if you think about this and just distill it for a second, how can you have two opposing ideological positions quibbling? English words are hard, right?
Well, I butchered William Blake and don't understand how to identify noun verbs.
Well, there we go. Two different sides.
I'm ahead or behind.
We're not done. Two different sides squabbling over an agreed upon outrage. These have to be, we started at the beginning by saying reality is slippery, right? This is the slipperiness that you and I can be on opposite sides of the fence, agree that there is a problem, reach drastically different ends about it, but that only serves to perpetuate this reality that we both want to come back to. If
Right.
we re-invoke Latour, the difference is that you see these situations as configuring one particular networked reality, and I'm going to see them as producing a very different one. They're the same.
Great point. Great point. That's the positive side of this argument. I mean, to me, that's the great value of what Baudrillard is doing, that he allows us to apprehend what you just said. That's really wonderful. Should we shift to an example of AI and see whether or not or are we ready for that?
Let's boldly
Should we shift to an example of AI and see how that fits with which you just mentioned? I guess the 2 or 3 things that you just brought up. The idea of the productivity of moral outrage, the idea of polarities of opinion, of political opinions and moral opinions, working to reinforce the precession of simulacra, keeping us within the hyperreal or sustaining the hyperreal. And okay, well, that's enough. And then we can think about how AI works and see if we can connect.
So when we talk about AI, just to make sure you and I are on the same page here, are we talking?
Sure. Well, you wanted to talk about, I don't think we'll have enough time this episode. I'm sure we'll be able to do it. Talk about the music. I've been thinking a lot about, because I've been hearing a lot about musical examples. And we read Michael and I read a great article by Dina Latovsky, where she talks about AI and photography. But I don't think we have time to talk about those manifestations of AI. And probably because of the discussion we've been having and we've just had, I think, Michael, we should turn to your example of ChatGPT AI in terms of ChatGPT and writing modes and structural writing. And maybe we can ride that one out here. Ride that out.
So the I guess the discussion centers around the rapid visibility and advent of ChatGPT as a writing tool, and English teachers and writing teachers everywhere freaking out. Moral indignation here, if you will. This is the pedagogical version of Watergate and Disney, right? That this is massively upsetting. We have a huge disruption. And if we apply this to Baudrillard as we are looking at it now, somehow we have to be able to say it's all the same, that this massive disruption essentially is a smokescreen where the return to normal is not a return and the departure was never a departure, right? Like this is all smoke and mirrors. And
well, let's break. I think it will help clarify your example if we temporalize it, because we were talking about this. Like you were saying, you said very interestingly in our pre-show show, you were saying that there's a kind of nostalgia. Again, we're talking about the rhetorical effect of certain discourses. So the discourse over ChatGPT kind of creates a nostalgia for a time when people write, when people wrote authentically, and when people were doing their own summaries. Now, that's not to say we're bracketing off now. This is the thing that was getting me upset earlier. But I do think you advance the science, you advance the argument if you can do a moral bracketing off, at least in this moment.
Sure.
Let's bracket off the question about whether or not it's good or positive or bad to have to introduce ChatGPT into instructional writing systems. What we do see, what I think Baudrillard does allow us to see, is that there is a discourse that surrounds these things that has its own structure and kind of its own momentum, so that as a consequence of the way in which we discuss it, that very soon, as soon as you do engage in this ChatGPT discourse, insofar as it relates to writing, you're kind of you have to think of it, you're almost the people who oppose ChatGPT have to make the claim, are find themselves making the position that it was better before this new technology was. And as you were saying earlier, to sort of bring this to a close, or my summary of this to a close, and I want to hear what you want to add to it. As you said earlier, we're nostalgic for a moment that never existed. Because the truth is, as you were saying, also, we've outsourced to AI a lot of our argument, the weather forecasting, questions and answers, knowledge production. We've outsourced that. So it's nostalgia it's a fake nostalgia or a misguided nostalgia in several respects. One of them is not only did the territory never exist, to use the map territory analogy, not only did that territory of the authentic never exist, but also the truth is our outrage is misplaced because we should have been outraged 20 years ago, or at least 10 years ago, when we began outsourcing in a major way our musical choices, our decisions in most aspects of our lives, especially in the relation to art and entertainment and politics.
Right. I think to look at this through the writing lens, though, because again, we got to be careful we don't spiral out, somehow I think that the outrage centers around the idea that having a chatbot do something disrupts a pure process of writing.
Thank you. Right? That's what I was trying to say. Thank you.
And so the outrage is that I can type my prompt into this and it will give me something back, right? And that is impure somehow. And we look past the reality that we use Google or pick your search engine or pick your library database to harvest the information for us. We use other tools and mechanisms to create works cited pages for us, right? While we're doing this, we're using a keyboard to type out the letters and save it for us, which is the updated version of writing it by pen, which is the updated version of the quill, right? Like there's been this continual process. Each is a disruption that takes us, okay, fine. The point that Baudrillard makes, I thought that was really interesting about this, is that and he talks about this with Viet Nam and about the United States only being able to pull out of Vietnam once we knew that Vietnam would be predictable without us there, that we have this disruption and we can only end the disruption once the disruption is able to drop back into the simulacra, right? That once it's able to be replicated faithfully.
You have to have that moment of achieved seriality or of repetition before.
That's a good way of putting it. And so basically, I think the argument around AI is like, oh my God, it's this massive disruption because it hasn't been able, that we've not been able to reabsorb it into the simulation. As we have other disruptions that we now don't see, that we think of as, I'll use the word pure again, right? That somehow have become a part of the purity of whatever process it is that we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't like that word, but I guess it's the one that we're rolling with here.
What word don't you like?
The purity, like this side. But
I think you have to use that word, Michael, actually, because what we're talking about is an affect, right? We're talking about this affect of nostalgia. If you're not thinking in these binary terms, actually the binary terms are what makes this fictional. It's what makes discourse fictional. And you're saying, I don't like those terms. What you mean is you're realizing the fictive nature of the term. But that's I think the point of this argument. I have to say, I'm just thinking about it. So I made two mistakes that I used AI to help me correct. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not ironic, there's the irony right there.
Well, I think we're bathed in it, to be honest with you. I mean, what is
it proves how much we're immersed in it, which is why the nostalgia argument is finally not an effective, not a positive argument. It doesn't get us anywhere to advance that argument.
Well, it's frustrating really to realize that we've just spent the past hour having this discussion over things that don't even really exist.
Well, there's that. Okay, now there's where we get this. Now, okay, you're getting my realist heebie-jeebies up again with that statement, but I take your previous point.
Well, it's a lot. I think that the takeaway from this, if we could, and there's so much that's still in here. I think the problem with Baudrillard is, again, speaking personally, that I want to look at this in terms of concrete material examples. And so when you say that this thing is a fiction, or that this thing is not real, or that we can't distinguish one thing from another, and he has numerous examples, that it sort of raises some eyebrows. Like that's this. It's tempting to look at this as one of those really, really extreme theoretical positions. But I think that his argument really becomes much more clear when we look at it through maybe a technological lens, and we realize how these are perceptions that we have that are informed by a particular position. And I think the easiest way of maybe giving some credence to what he's saying is to think about one generation's lived experience versus a prior generation's experience, right? Like, my world is very, very different than the world that my parents came up in. And my children's world is going to be completely unrecognizable to the world that my grandparents grew up in, despite the fact that the material realities of these worlds are the same. Like they're identical physically, right? But the perception of things is profoundly different, and the way that we understand is profoundly different, because what he's talking about with Disney or Watergate, these are interpretations, and the things that we choose to believe are influenced essentially by the way that we configure our understandings, and it's not so concrete.
That's a wonderful takeaway. I very much like your example of the generational differences. I think while you were talking, I think I came with my takeaway. I feel that I've been very confused in this episode, but I think I want to let it stand, because as you were talking, I realized I think I'm able to say a little bit more concisely why I don't like this essay, but I need this essay. So let me use that as my takeaway.
That's good.
Why don't I like this essay? It's precisely, you began your discourse about the generations and mentioning this, and it's precisely why this essay I talked about the heebie-jeebies and not liking it. That's just a way of saying that this essay does make me very defensive. I come to this essay and read it with a lot of resistances. And I think all the resistances that I have to the argument have to do with one thing. I always read his arguments, especially the argument that you were reading about, the initial argument about Watergate, where he, to me, blithely collapses the difference between political critique and other ways of perception. That gets me upset. Why does that make me upset? It makes me upset because, in the same way that he makes me upset throughout the essay, he is emphasizing the ways in which I have no agency and that you have no agency. So that's the negative thing. Like all the confused things I've been spouting, it really comes down to this, that he is reminding me of the ways I don't have agency, and I don't like that. And I always want to create arguments or counter arguments. So I said two things. I said, I don't like this essay. And so I just spoke for that poll.
I like
that a lot. But then why do I need things? Yeah. Now I'm going to end by saying why I need this essay. Why I need this essay is all the other things that you've been very patiently expounding, Michael. Because when we try to describe the processes, when we try to think about how, to use the most recent example you gave, to use that example of how material world doesn't change, but then conceptually it's completely changed. between generations. When we think about specific moments of controversy about that occur in different shifts, different epoch, that accompany different shifts in technology, I need Baudrillard to help me understand that and to see that. Mm-hmm. So that's why I don't like this essay, but why I feel that we need it, and I especially need it.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's right. And I get that. If you look at this in terms of him saying basically, you have no control. You are really responding. You think you're responding to fiction,
but you're not.
But you're not. You're just sort of there. And I think it's an easy argument to disagree with, but like you, I think it's a useful tool in the toolbox.
It's not even. I mean, the more I talk about it and you talk about it and I think about it, it's like I end up thinking this is just totally necessary. It's like, media studies needs this kind of argument to be. Without this kind of argument, we can't really describe these moments of controversy and change that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Barry, I enjoyed the discussion. Don't know if we went anywhere. But I don't know if we can.
We went nowhere, but we can go nowhere. And on that dispiriting moment, it's not dispiriting. It just is. It just is, Michael. It just is.
I hope that you enjoy yourself this week, and I will look forward to picking this up in the same place, which will feel different somehow with what we do next.
I agree. Thank you, Michael. Thanks very much for the discussion.
Appreciate All right, Barry. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.